The auction house hummed with quiet murmurs, a sea of wealthy buyers in tailored suits and polished boots. The scent of fresh hay and leather mixed with the distant tang of cigar smoke. Spotlights illuminated the center ring, where another horse was paraded under the auctioneer's sharp gaze. The air carried an unmistakable tension, the kind that came with fortunes changing hands over bloodlines and prestige. Henry Dawson sat near the back, unnoticed among the elite. His worn denim jacket and calloused hands marked him as an outsider in this world of flashing wealth. He had come here with no intention of buying, merely observing, filling the silence of his empty days with something familiar. The ranch had been quiet since his wife passed, too quiet. The work still needed doing, the animals still needed tending, but without her laughter, the land had lost its warmth. The auctioneer's voice rang through the speakers, snapping Henry from his thoughts. Next in the lineup, a chestnut stallion, 7 years old. Bidding starts at 15,000. A handler led the horse into the ring, its coat dull under the harsh lights. It was a striking animal, broad-chested with strong legs, but something about it was off. The stallion's ears flicked back at the slightest movement, nostrils flared with unease. Its eyes, wide and sharp, darted between the faces in the crowd, as if searching for something or someone. The silence stretched uncomfortably. A few murmurs rippled through the audience. He's got no spirit. Look at the way he holds himself. He's skittish. 7 years old and no pedigree worth mentioning? Not worth the trouble. The auctioneer cleared his throat, adjusting his stance. Gentlemen, this is a fine animal, strong and healthy. Who'll start us off at 15,000? No hands went up. A flicker of something passed through Henry's chest. Not pity. Not yet. But something close. The auctioneer's voice remained steady, but there was a slight strain beneath the practiced salesmanship. 10,000. Nothing. The murmurs grew. A man in a dark coat whispered something to his companion, shaking his head. 5,000. The stallion shifted, muscles tensing, but he did not lash out. He merely stood there, ears twitching, as if waiting for something inevitable. Henry studied the horse. There was no obvious sign of injury, no limp, no weakness, but there was hesitation in its stance, a wariness that spoke of something deeper than simple nervousness. 2,000. A few chuckles scattered through the audience. The auctioneer forced a smile, but Henry could see it, a bead of sweat forming near his temple, the growing desperation in his voice. No auctioneer wanted to admit they had a worthless horse on their hands. 1,000. The room seemed to shrink. The stallion's breath was visible in the cool air, a steady, misty rhythm. His gaze flicked toward Henry. The old rancher shifted in his chair. What was it about those eyes? 500. A pause. A single breath. Henry raised his hand. Silence fell over the auction house. The auctioneer hesitated for only a moment before slamming his gavel down. Sold, to the gentleman in the back. The murmurs grew into full conversations, but Henry ignored them. He stood slowly, joints aching as he made his way toward the holding area. The wealthy buyers had already turned their attention to the next horse, the next bid, the next trophy to add to their stables. Outside, the stable hands were leading the stallion toward Henry's trailer. The horse resisted slightly, eyes darting, breath still quick. The young man holding the lead rope glanced at Henry with something like amusement. "You sure about this one, sir?" he asked. Nobody wanted him for a reason. Henry ran a hand over the horse's neck. The stallion shuddered but did not pull away. "What's his name?" The stable hand shrugged. "They just call him Lot 27. Henry exhaled slowly, feeling the roughness of the horse's coat beneath his fingers. "Not anymore," he murmured. "Rustler. That's what I'll call you." Rustler's ears twitched, the first flicker of something resembling curiosity passing through his expression. The ride home was long. The highway stretched ahead in a blur of asphalt and faded headlights. The weight of exhaustion pressed against Henry's bones, but he kept one eye on the road, the other glancing back at the trailer every so often. Rustler stood rigid inside, unmoving, barely shifting with the motion of the truck. Something had happened to this horse. Henry had seen broken animals before, had nursed them back to health. But this This wasn't just fear. It was something else, something buried deep. When he pulled up to the ranch, the night had settled in fully, a blanket of stars overhead. The land stretched out before him, quiet and waiting. The fences, the barn, the open fields, it was all still here, unchanged, though he had changed within it. He opened the trailer carefully, speaking in a low voice. "All right, Rustler. This is home now." The stallion did not move. His ears were pinned back, eyes locked on the unfamiliar surroundings. Henry didn't rush him. He simply leaned against the trailer, watching, waiting. Minutes passed. Then more. A breeze rolled in, carrying the scent of earth and hay. Rustler took one cautious step forward. Then another. The sound of hooves hitting solid ground was quiet but significant. Henry let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He guided Rustler toward the barn, keeping his movements slow, steady. The other horses stirred in their stalls, watching the newcomer with mild interest. Rustler hesitated at the entrance, nostrils flaring. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Henry glanced at the sky. The storm would be here soon. He had hoped to get Rustler settled before the weather turned, but it seemed the horse would have to choose between the barn and the open field quickly. The stallion took another step inside, hooves clicking softly against the wooden floor. Henry unlatched a stall door, guiding him in. Rustler didn't fight it, but his body remained tense, as if expecting something to go wrong. Henry removed the lead rope and stepped back. Rustler didn't move from where he stood, chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. "You're safe now," Henry said quietly. Rustler didn't respond, but he didn't retreat either. That was enough. Henry shut the stall door and leaned against it, rubbing a hand over his face. His body ached from the long day, but his mind was alive with questions. Why had no one wanted this horse? Why had Rustler looked at him that way? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the barn doors slightly. The first drops of rain began to patter against the roof. Henry watched as Rustler finally moved, just slightly, shifting his weight, ears flicking toward the sound of the rain. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was something. A beginning. And for the first time in a long while, Henry felt something stir inside himself as well. The morning broke with a crisp chill, the kind that lingered just long enough to remind Henry of the passing seasons. The ranch had always followed its own rhythm, days dictated by the sun and the work that needed doing. But today, there was something different in the air. Rustler stood in the corner of his stall, watching as Henry moved about the barn, his posture as rigid as the night before. The other horses had already grown used to his presence, their initial curiosity fading into familiarity. But Rustler remained apart, his eyes never resting on one thing for too long, his muscles coiled as if expecting the worst. Henry had seen this before, a horse that had been mishandled, mistreated. But there was something more to Rustler's silence, something that nagged at the edges of Henry's thoughts. He moved slowly as he approached, careful not to startle the stallion. He carried a bucket of fresh grain, setting it down just outside the stall before leaning against the wooden frame. "I'm not going to force you," he said, his voice low, steady. "You take your time." Rustler's ears twitched at the sound, but he didn't move forward. Instead, he stared at Henry, his gaze sharp, assessing. Henry sighed, shifting his weight. "You've got some fight left in you. That's good." He stayed there for a while, the quiet of the barn settling around them. Rustler didn't come closer, but he didn't retreat either. That was enough for now. The day stretched on in the usual way, mucking stalls, fixing fences, checking on the cattle. Work that kept the body moving, the mind occupied. But even as he went through the familiar motions, Henry found his thoughts returning to the horse standing alone in the barn. By midday, he decided it was time. Rustler needed to move, to stretch his legs, to feel the earth beneath him. Henry opened the stall door carefully, stepping aside to give the stallion room to decide. For a moment, Rustler didn't move. Then, with slow, measured steps, he crossed the threshold, his hooves tapping against the barn floor. He hesitated at the entrance, nostrils flaring as the open land stretched before him. Henry didn't interfere. He simply waited. Then, as if breaking free from invisible chains, Rustler moved. He stepped out into the sunlight, blinking against the brightness. The wind carried the scent of fresh grass, and for the first time, Henry saw something shift in the horse's stance, something lighter, less guarded. Rustler took a few cautious steps forward, then stopped, ears flicking toward the sounds of the ranch. The distant clatter of tools, the occasional call of a crow, the steady rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was a world unfamiliar, yet oddly familiar. Henry walked a few steps behind, keeping his presence known but not overbearing. He let Rustler take the lead, let him explore at his own pace. The stallion's movements were hesitant, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Then, in a sudden burst, Rustler took off. His muscles coiled and released in an instant, hooves pounding against the earth as he surged forward, his body stretching into full gallop. The sheer power in his movements was undeniable, a force that had been caged for too long. Henry watched, his breath caught in his throat. Rustler ran like he had been waiting for this moment forever, like the wind itself carried him forward. He kicked up dirt, his strides long and effortless. Then, just as suddenly as he had started, he stopped. He stood at the far end of the pasture, sides heaving, head high. His ears swiveled as he took in the land around him, as if realizing for the first time that he was free. Henry approached slowly, stopping a good distance away. Rustler turned his head, eyes locking onto him. "You remember how that feels, don't you?" Henry murmured. Rustler didn't move, but something in his gaze softened. Over the next few days, the rhythm between them shifted. Rustler still kept his distance, but he no longer flinched at Henry's presence. He ate, drank, and moved without hesitation, no longer frozen by whatever ghosts haunted him. But Henry knew there was still something buried beneath the surface. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the land, Henry sat outside the barn, watching Rustler graze. The stallion's coat had begun to regain its luster, his muscles less tense. "You had a life before this," Henry said, mostly to himself. "Somebody taught you things. Somebody trained you." Rustler flicked his ears, but didn't lift his head. "I just don't know what happened after that." The thought lingered unanswered. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Henry woke to the sound of rustling outside. He pulled on his boots and stepped onto the porch, squinting through the darkness. Rustler stood near the fence, his body rigid, eyes locked onto something beyond the ranch's borders. His breath came in short bursts, nostrils flaring. Henry followed his gaze, but saw nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the dark outline of the hills in the distance. Still, something wasn't right. He took a few steps forward. Rustler didn't move, didn't blink. It was as if he were trapped in some distant memory, frozen in place. Henry approached carefully, murmuring soft reassurances. "It's just the wind, boy. Nothing to be afraid of." Rustler's muscles twitched, his body coiled tight, but he didn't bolt. He just stood there, lost in something Henry couldn't see. Henry reached out, his fingers brushing against Rustler's coat. The stallion jerked slightly, but didn't pull away. Something had happened to him. Something bad. Henry exhaled slowly. "I don't know what they did to you," he whispered, "but they ain't here anymore." The wind carried his words away, but Rustler heard them. He shifted slightly, the tension in his body easing just a fraction. Henry stayed with him until the wind died down, until Rustler's breathing evened out, until the stallion's eyes softened once more. That night, as Henry lay in bed, he thought of the way Rustler had stared into the darkness, and for the first time, he realized that Rustler wasn't just afraid. He was waiting for something, or someone. The morning sun painted the horizon in hues of amber and gold, its warmth stretching over the fields and casting long shadows across the ranch. Henry leaned against the fence, a cup of coffee cradled in his weathered hands, watching Rustler move through the pasture. The stallion had changed in the past weeks. His coat gleamed under the sunlight. His once wary eyes held curiosity instead of fear. But the weight of the past still lingered in the way he carried himself, like a ghost that refused to leave. Rustler stopped near the fence line, ears pricking forward as he stared into the distance. Henry followed his gaze, seeing nothing but rolling hills and the occasional tree swaying in the wind. It was always the same, Rustler looking toward something unseen, something just beyond reach. Henry exhaled, setting his coffee down on the fence post. He had learned patience a long time ago, but Rustler was testing even his limits. He knew the stallion was holding on to something, a memory or a fear so deeply rooted it had become part of him. And Henry couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was getting closer. That afternoon, he saddled Rustler for the first time. The stallion didn't fight, didn't rear or bolt, but there was a stiffness to him, a resistance just beneath the surface. Henry worked slowly, fastening the girth, adjusting the bridle, giving Rustler time to process each step. The moment he placed his foot in the stirrup, the stallion tensed, muscles locking like a coiled spring. "Easy, boy," Henry murmured, keeping his movements deliberate. "Ain't nobody gonna hurt you." He swung into the saddle, settling his weight carefully. Rustler shifted beneath him, his breathing quick and uneven. Henry let him stand there, giving him time to decide whether to trust or fight. A moment passed. Then another. Rustler took a step forward. It was small, hesitant, but it was something. Henry guided him with the lightest touch, letting the stallion dictate the pace. They moved through the pasture, Rustler's ears flicking back toward Henry every few strides. His muscles remained taut, but he didn't panic. They rode until the sun hung low in the sky, until Rustler's steps became more confident, his breathing steady. When Henry finally dismounted, he ran a hand down the stallion's neck, feeling the sweat beneath his palm. Rustler stood still, watching him, his dark eyes searching. "You're getting there," Henry said softly. That night, the dream came again. It wasn't his dream, but it felt real all the same. Shadows stretching long against the ground, voices raised in anger, the sharp snap of a whip. Rustler screams, raw and terrified. Running. A gate slamming shut. Darkness swallowing everything. Henry woke with a start, his heart hammering against his ribs. He sat up, rubbing a hand over his face. The room was dark, the ranch silent except for the steady hum of crickets outside. But something felt off. He threw on his coat and stepped outside. The air was thick with an uneasy stillness. Then he saw him. A man stood near the far fence, half hidden in the shadows. He wasn't moving, just watching. The sight of him sent a slow, crawling chill down Henry's spine. Rustler was near the barn, his body rigid, ears pinned flat against his skull. His breathing came in short, frantic bursts, his hooves shifting restlessly in the dirt. Henry took a step forward, his voice firm. "Who's there?" The figure didn't answer. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, just as Henry moved to take another step, the man turned and disappeared into the darkness. Henry ran to the fence, but by the time he reached it, there was nothing there. No footprints, no sound, nothing. But Rustler knew. Henry turned back to the stallion, his own pulse unsteady. Rustler was shaking, his muscles trembling beneath his coat. His eyes were wide, wild, the way they had been the first night Henry brought him home. Henry's jaw tightened. He had spent weeks trying to piece together the fragments of Rustler's past, but now, he didn't need to. The past had come looking for them. The next morning, Henry saddled Rustler again. This time, there was no hesitation, no stiffness. The stallion moved with purpose, as if he understood that running wasn't an option anymore. They rode out past the ranch, through the hills where the trees grew thick and the land sloped downward. Henry didn't know what he was looking for, but his gut told him the answer was somewhere ahead. They reached the old road, just as the sun hit its peak. The dirt path was overgrown, forgotten, but Henry could see the remnants of something more, a broken fence, a rusted sign hanging from a single nail. Then Rustler stopped. Henry followed his gaze and saw it, a burned-out barn, its skeletal remains blackened with age. The roof had caved in, the wooden beams nothing more than splintered wreckage. But the brand on the side, barely visible beneath the scorch marks, was unmistakable. Henry's stomach twisted. He had seen that mark before. At the auction, he dismounted, approaching the ruins slowly. Rustler stayed where he was, his breath coming in sharp exhales. Henry could feel the tension radiating off him, the way his body quivered with something deeper than fear. Henry crouched near the entrance, running his fingers over the charred wood. The ground beneath him was littered with broken glass, old chains rusted from years of rain and neglect. Then he saw it, a name carved into the wood, barely legible beneath the layers of soot and time. Rustler. Henry inhaled sharply. This wasn't just any barn. This was Rustler's past, and someone had tried to erase it. The realization hit him like a blow. Whatever had happened here, whatever Rustler had endured, it hadn't been an accident. Someone had wanted to destroy the evidence. A twig snapped behind him. Henry turned sharply, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt. The man from the fence stood a few yards away, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. But Henry could feel the weight of his stare, the quiet menace in his stance. Henry rose slowly, his voice steady. "You looking for something?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his gaze flicking toward Rustler. Henry's fingers tightened around the knife's handle. "You took something that wasn't yours," the man finally said, his voice low, measured. Henry's pulse pounded in his ears. "He wasn't yours to keep." The man's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered in his eyes. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Henry's jaw clenched. "I know enough." The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken threats. Then, without another word, the man turned and walked away. Henry didn't move until he was sure the stranger was gone. Then he turned back to Rustler, reaching out to run a hand down the stallion's neck. Rustler exhaled, his muscles finally relaxing under Henry's touch. "We're not running anymore," Henry murmured. Rustler didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. For the first time, he stood his ground,